We've seen this pattern before. One nation rises, the other pushes back, not with bombs, but with tariffs. Trump has just reignited a global economic conflict, not against China alone, but against the entire BRICS bloc. And Brazil? It's not backing down. But here's the part no one's talking about. This isn't just politics. It's a power realignment, one that echoes the trade wars before both world wars. What happens next may decide which nations thrive and which collapse. Let's go back and forward. Not every war starts with tanks. Some start with tariffs, numbers, and old revenge. When Trump hit BRICS nations with a new wave of punitive tariffs, the world hesitated. Brazil didn't. It fired back, with defiance. To most, it looked like just another trade spat, a policy tweak, a nationalist speech. But underneath, a deeper crack is forming. This isn't just about economics, it's about power. And who gets to write the global rules next? The US. Once the center of global commerce, now finds itself surrounded. Coalitions are rising. And this time, Brazil didn't just watch, it led. The timing? No accident. BRICS is gaining mass, surpassing the G7 in GDP, representing half the world's population. But what rattled Washington wasn't the math, it was the message. Brazil, once a Western ally, stood beside China and Russia, denouncing tariffs, questioning the dollar, rejecting sanctions. On the surface, trade policy. In reality, the first strike in something much bigger. Trump, in classic fashion, doubled down. 10% tariffs on nations with anti-American alignment. 25% threats on Japan and South Korea. But, again, this isn't about percentages. It's about narrative control. And that's where the US is bleeding. Brazil's answer? Who's afraid of the big bad wolf? It wasn't just a jab. It was a message. Loud, clear, and global. Listen closely, and you'll hear what no one wants to say. The Global South isn't asking for a seat at the table anymore. It's building its own. The real question isn't why Trump started this. It's why now, and what Brazil might be planning next. Because buried beneath the press releases and summit photos is a shift in power moving faster than most people think. And it all starts here. Before we go deeper, ask yourself this. How do you stay ahead in a world that shifts by the hour? This channel doesn't just track events, it explains the strategy behind them. Trade wars, power plays, hidden agendas. If you can see the pattern, you can stay ready. This isn't fear, it's awareness. Know the fault lines before they break. If this hits home, drop your take in the comments. Is Brazil's move bold or reckless? I'll be reading everything. And if this kind of clarity helps, share the video. Because this isn't just about tariffs, it's about who writes the next global playbook. Now, back to why this moment could change everything. The tension between Washington and Brasilia didn't start with Trump's latest outburst. It began much earlier, buried in decades of global imbalance. When the BRICS alliance was first proposed in the early 2000s, it was dismissed as a symbolic gesture, a loose collection of developing economies with no real challenge to Western dominance. But, over time, it grew teeth, economic weight, political intention, strategic clarity. And now, it's no longer a question of if the BRICS can rival the West, but when. The US once set the terms of global commerce through institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO. But BRICS members, especially China, Russia, and increasingly Brazil, saw something different. An architecture built to preserve Western power, not to promote global equity. While these organizations preached multilateralism, the terms were often laced with conditions, privatizations, austerity, dollar dependency. For much of the global South, it wasn't cooperation. It was compliance. Brazil, for most of its modern history, walked a careful line between alignment and autonomy. Even under military rule, it sought strategic distance from U.S. mandates when it mattered most. But something shifted after the turn of the millennium. With China's rise, Russia's resurgence, and India's ambitions, the BRICS began to signal more than just economic collaboration. It became a message. We don't need permission anymore. And Brazil? It became the pivot. Not as strong militarily as Russia, not as economically central as China. But politically? Brazil held the soft power currency that others lacked: diplomatic legitimacy, environmental leadership, democratic symbolism. That made it a threat. Quiet, but unmistakable. So when BRICS began pushing for reforms in global governance, more votes at the IMF, less reliance on the US dollar, alternative lending mechanisms through the new development bank, it wasn't an economic maneuver. It was a geopolitical declaration, and the United States noticed. But what Trump noticed was something else. Brazil didn't just sign the BRICS declaration, it defended it. It stood on the same stage as China and Russia and called out the West, not just for tariffs, but for hypocrisy, for weaponizing trade, for claiming to promote democracy while undermining sovereignty. And here's where the fault lines begin to crack. Because while the headlines focused on interest rates and currency swaps, behind closed doors, another conversation had already started. One that could redraw the entire map of economic alliances. But not just yet. We'll come back to that. Then came the spark. On the surface, just another policy announcement from Trump's campaign trail. But this time, the target wasn't China. It wasn't even Russia. It was the very foundation of a new global realignment, the BRICS. And Brazil, once seen as the least confrontational of the bloc, found itself at the center of the storm. In a series of escalating statements, Trump announced a flat 10% tariff on any country that aligns itself against American interests. The subtext was unmistakable. The BRICS' final declaration, criticizing U.S. tariffs, denouncing attacks on Iranian territory, and calling for reform of global institutions, was interpreted not just as dissent, but as defiance. For Trump, it wasn't an economic issue. It was personal. A challenge to American authority and, by extension, his own. Brazil didn't flinch. Instead, it answered with irony. Celso Amorim, veteran diplomat and advisor to President Lula, responded with a phrase that echoed louder than any official communiqué. Who's afraid of the big bad wolf? A rhetorical jab, yes, but also a calculated signal. Brazil was done playing the role of junior partner. And more importantly, it knew it wasn't alone. The timing of this confrontation wasn't random. It followed years of U.S. protectionism, where strategic allies like Japan and South Korea were hit with 25% tariffs overnight. The logic was always the same: close the trade deficit, protect American jobs, preserve domestic industry. But the method, unilateral imposition, shattered the illusion of partnership. And as the BRICS bloc expanded its influence, these methods began to look less like policy and more like punishment. But here's what few are noticing. Trump's strategy isn't only about economics. It's about narrative disruption. By targeting BRICS with sweeping tariffs, he frames them as aggressors, nations undermining the rules-based order. In that frame, any countermeasure becomes an act of hostility. Any refusal to comply is cast as a betrayal. It's a classic projection technique, but with global stakes. Brazil, however, played a different game. It didn't issue counter-tariffs. It didn't summon ambassadors. Instead, it leaned into the message of sovereignty. "No one is above our laws," said President Lula. "We are a sovereign nation." Simple, measured, but loaded. Because beneath that calm exterior is a much more dangerous implication. If the U.S. continues to weaponize trade, then Brazil, and perhaps the rest of the global South, will begin to weaponize unity. And that's where things start to unravel. Because for all its power, the U.S. depends on perception, on allies believing it still holds the center, on rivals fearing retaliation. But what happens when the fear fades? When countries like Brazil decide that the risk of retaliation is worth the cost of independence? We haven't reached that moment. Not yet. But the line is thinning, and Trump's next move may determine whether that line holds or finally snaps. By the time the letters arrived in Tokyo and Seoul, warning of 25% tariffs on key exports, the message was no longer limited to BRICS. This was a signal to every U.S. partner. Loyalty would be measured and punished in dollars. Behind the official language of trade imbalances and deficit correction was a clear ultimatum. Either align with Washington's worldview or face economic retaliation. Trump's calculus was simple but dangerous. Use tariffs as leverage, squeeze concessions through pressure, and show the American electorate that he remains the ultimate dealmaker. But the global repercussions, less predictable. Because for countries like Japan and South Korea, this wasn't just economic aggression, it was humiliation. And for neutral players observing from the sidelines, a warning. Brazil saw the writing on the wall. Though not yet targeted with the same severity, the country understood the pattern. Today, it's tariffs. Tomorrow, it could be sanctions, financial restrictions, blocking access to key technologies. The U.S. toolkit is vast, but not infinite. And every tool it uses erodes a bit more of the credibility it once commanded. The BRICS bloc, despite its internal contradictions, recognized this moment as an inflection point. The decision to challenge the dominance of the dollar, to question the legitimacy of institutions like the IMF and World Bank, and to demand a rebalancing of global voting power wasn't spontaneous. It was the result of years of slow erosion, of watching the U.S. apply rules asymmetrically, preaching free markets while weaponizing them when convenient. And yet, the most revealing aspect of this silent escalation isn't what Trump said. It's what the other powers didn't. China's response was measured. Russia's, diplomatically cold. Even India, typically cautious, reaffirmed its commitment to multipolar engagement. The tone was coordinated. Not confrontational, but unyielding. A coalition forming not through ideology, but through shared pressure. There's a paradox unfolding here. The more Washington attempts to isolate the BRICS, the more it binds them together. Not because of mutual admiration, but because of mutual necessity. Trade, energy, currency. These aren't ideological domains. They're survival tools. And for the first time in decades, a significant portion of the world is seeking those tools elsewhere. But this doesn't mean the U.S. has lost its grip. Not yet. What it has lost is something harder to quantify: the benefit of the doubt. And that loss, it spreads faster than tariffs ever could. Now, Brazil stands at a crossroads, not in the traditional sense of East versus West, but in something more subtle, whether to gamble on proximity to power or on the promise of autonomy. The choice isn't easy, and the consequences still unfolding. But one decision has already been made. Silence is no longer an option. The game has changed. And soon, the stakes will too. While Trump sharpened his rhetoric and headlines focused on tariffs and retaliation, something else was unfolding quietly beneath the surface. Brazil was repositioning itself, not as a battleground, but as a bridge, a strategic actor capable of operating between worlds. And this is where the story becomes less about confrontation and more about leverage. Brazil's geopolitical advantage isn't measured in tanks or tariffs. It's measured in access to energy, to food production, to biodiversity, to critical raw materials like niobium and rare earths. In a world where global supply chains are increasingly vulnerable, these aren't just economic assets. They're bargaining chips. And Brazil knows it. That's why the tone of Brasilia's response was never purely defensive. It was calibrated. From Lula's refusal to engage in direct confrontation, to Celso Amorim's calculated provocation, every word signaled a shift. Brazil no longer sees itself as subordinate to American preferences. It sees itself as a necessary node in a new global architecture, a connector, not a follower. And this is where the threat lies, not in overt opposition, but in the quiet refusal to obey. The BRICS summit declarations, the push for alternatives to the IMF, the suggestion that trade between global South nations should no longer default to the dollar, none of these are attacks. They're escapes, strategic exits from a system that no longer serves their ambitions. But here's what complicates everything. Even as Brazil steps away from dependency, it cannot fully detach. The U.S. remains Brazil's second-largest trading partner. American financial influence still touches every corner of Brazil's economy. But this dependency is mutual. From agricultural imports to energy cooperation, Washington relies on Brazilian stability more than it admits. And this interdependence, this quiet entanglement, is where the real game unfolds. Because if Brazil can prove that sovereignty and cooperation aren't mutually exclusive, it sets a precedent. That a nation doesn't need to choose between East and West, between alignment and isolation. That the global South can be something more than a pawn in someone else's strategy. And that precedent? It's far more dangerous to Washington than any tariff. Which is why Trump's aggressive stance may not just be about punishing Brazil. It may be about containing an idea before it spreads. But there's one detail still missing. One move Brazil hasn't made. Yet. We'll return to that, because if it happens, the entire equation could shift overnight. If the current trajectory holds, we're not witnessing a temporary dispute. We're watching the architecture of global trade being redrawn in real time. The next steps won't be about rhetoric. They'll be about alignment. And Brazil, once hesitant to lead, may soon be forced to choose. In the short term, three paths are emerging. The first is negotiation. There's still a narrow window for de-escalation. Diplomatic back channels where Brazil and the U.S. could agree on limited trade concessions in exchange for tariff exemptions. It would be a return to pragmatism, but it would come at a cost: credibility within the BRICS bloc, and perhaps more dangerously, the perception of retreat. The second path is entrenchment. Brazil may double down on its BRICS alignment, pushing forward currency swap agreements, increased lending through the new development bank, and further de-dollarization of trade with China and India. If that happens, the U.S. could respond with broader sanctions, not just on goods, but on Brazilian banks, energy exports, or tech imports. That level of confrontation risks triggering a full-scale economic decoupling, something both nations claim to avoid, but continue preparing for. Then there's the third path, the unspoken one. A hybrid strategy where Brazil continues to criticize U.S. hegemony rhetorically, while quietly securing backdoor deals with American partners. It would be diplomacy by camouflage, a game of balancing interests without committing fully to either side. But history shows that neutrality, when prolonged, eventually becomes isolation. And yet, beneath these surface scenarios lies a more volatile possibility, one that's not being openly discussed. Brazil, under rising internal pressure, both economic and political, may begin to leverage its alignment with BRICS as a domestic shield, painting external conflict as a badge of sovereignty, as a distraction from inflation, from stagnation, from political fractures. If that happens, confrontation won't just escalate abroad, it will internalize. This is where the risk shifts from economic fallout to strategic miscalculation. Because the moment leaders start using global crises as domestic narratives, the consequences become harder to control, and what was once a trade dispute becomes something more combustible. But that final move, the one Brazil hasn't yet made, remains the wild card. If it chooses to shift energy trade away from the dollar entirely, or join China's push for a global alternative payment system, the backlash from Washington won't be diplomatic. It'll be systemic. We're close. But not there yet. There's still time. Just not much. Trade wars rarely end with winners. More often, they redraw the battlefield. And in this case, the battleground is far larger than tariffs. It's the architecture of trust. For decades, the United States operated not just through economic power, but through perceived stability, predictability. That's what made the dollar king. That's what turned American partnerships into defaults. But that trust, once cracked, doesn't return easily. Brazil's defiance may seem like a diplomatic gesture, a regional assertion of sovereignty, but it signals something deeper, a shift in gravitational pull, from passive alignment to active strategy, from accepting the rules to questioning who gets to write them. And once that shift begins, it rarely reverses. The question isn't whether the BRICS will succeed in replacing the dollar or dismantling the Western order. The question is, how many nations, faced with threats like Trump's tariffs, will quietly begin to explore the exits, to ask if there's another way, another block, another system. And the irony is, by trying to coerce loyalty, Washington may be accelerating the very fragmentation it seeks to prevent. That's the paradox of hegemony. The tighter the grip, the faster the slip. Brazil, for now, walks a careful path. Defiant, but not reckless. Vocal, but not inflammatory. It still believes in cooperation, but only as equals. And if the U.S. wants to preserve what remains of its influence, it may need to relearn a principle it once taught the world. Respect can't be demanded. It must be earned. So, what comes next? That depends not on treaties or declarations, but on choices. Quiet, strategic choices made behind closed doors, in boardrooms, in diplomatic lounges, and, perhaps, in places we're not meant to see. Because sometimes, the most important shifts happen without a sound. Now, I want to hear from you. What do you think Brazil should do? Should it continue to challenge U.S. pressure? Or seek a middle ground before the cost becomes too high? Drop your thoughts below. I read every comment. And if this video helped you see the bigger picture, consider sharing it. Because clarity is the first step toward resilience. And in a world shaped by shifting alliances, that clarity might just be your greatest asset. If you made it this far, it means you're not just watching history, you're trying to understand it. That's rare, and it's powerful. Because in a world flooded with noise, the ability to connect dots, see patterns, and think ahead, that's what gives you an edge. And here, that's exactly what we do. So, if you believe these stories matter, stories of global power, hidden negotiations, and the silent forces shaping your future, then I invite you to join this journey. Subscribe to the channel. Hit the like button so more people see what the headlines won't show. And most importantly, share this video with someone who still thinks it's all just politics. Because what's really at stake is direction, and possibly destiny. Here, we talk about everything they don't teach you in school. From forgotten empires to modern alliances. From secret wars to strategic moves no one explains. If you ever wondered why things really happen the way they do, this is where the answers begin. Drop your questions in the comments, your doubts, your theories. We read them all. Because this isn't just about the past or the present, it's about preparing for what comes next. And whatever happens, one thing is certain. When you understand the world, it becomes a little less scary, a little more manageable, and a lot more hopeful. We're living through uncertain times, but uncertainty doesn't mean chaos. It means opportunity. And together, we'll keep uncovering the signals beneath the noise. I'll see you in the next one. Stay sharp, stay curious, and remember, it's not about fear, it's about foresight.